Welcome back to Church History, and we're moving on to talk again about the Reformation. We've looked previously at some pre-Reformation reformers, and then at Martin Luther and the Reformation that began in Germany. And we're going to move on in this session to think about Anabaptists, the Swiss Reformation, and then Reformation in England. And again, just because of the constraints of time and the masses of material that one could cover on this kind of a course, we will of necessity have to limit what we say in this class. So today, Switzerland is a little country somewhere in Europe, famous for its cheeses, watches, and illegal bank accounts. But Switzerland has had bigger and more influential days. Some of the great reformers of the church came from places that are now a part of what is called Switzerland. Around the year 1500 AD, what is today Switzerland was actually 13 separate self-governing cantons, or districts. We might have called them counties, or even areas within a county. They're kind of like tiny countries loosely linked together because of common interests. But each of those cantons was run by its own democratically elected government, and each government had considerable power over its own territory. For example, they decided what religion their people would be. The progressive governments for those times and the growth of education and humanism in these cantons made them fertile ground for the ideas of the Reformation. Erasmus, who we mentioned last time as one of the biblical humanists, worked in one of the cantons in Switzerland when he edited and published his Greek New Testament back in 1513. Swiss people had a reputation for independence and a fighting spirit, and many Swiss men were actually mercenaries. So we're going to, just to summarise in advance where we're going now, that there are three important branches of Reformation in Switzerland, or that grew up in the Swiss territory. The first type was that taught by Ulrich Zwingli and the northern cantons, the German-speaking ones. Zwingli was from Zurich. The second, that of John Calvin. Calvin was associated with the southern French-speaking cantons, and Calvin was situated for much of his life in Geneva, one of those southern cantons. The third branch of the Reformation theology stemmed from Switzerland was the Radical Reformation, people who had originally been aligned with Zwingli but who went even more radical. This group broke with Zurich and spread through other countries, even more radical. So we might just mention at this point a group of believers that grew up out of these Reformation works and Catholic Church protestations against Catholicism, and a little group who were called Anabaptists. Now, Anabaptist simply means rebaptizers. And as far as the groupings were concerned, it was a kind of wrong title, because they didn't see themselves really as being rebaptized, because they didn't feel that their infant baptisms in the Catholic Church had ever had any meaning to it. So they didn't see themselves as being rebaptized. They saw themselves as being baptized as believers. And I would just make an important comment here, because I think this sometimes passes. that for those of us who dedicate babies and then baptize later in life, we're talking about believers' baptism rather than adult baptism. But this was a very tricky situation in the times that this happened, and caused some quite considerable difficulties for the Anabaptists. And there were a number of martyrdoms that came out of this, as these people refused to baptize their babies or christen their babies, and rather were baptized much later on. Now, we take all of this for granted today with Baptists and other churches that came out of that kind of movement, and generally speaking we maybe don't have too many problems. But I am just recalling in my own mind here that when I first came into pastoral ministry in the late 1970s and was pastoring at that time in a Baptist church, and God was moving and people were getting converted. But many of the people that were getting converted were people who had been christened by their parents in usually the Anglican church many years before. And now, as we were sharing the gospel and preaching, these people wanted to be baptized by immersion, by believers' baptism. And to be really quite honest, it was not very long before we had several Anglican clergy, Church of England clergy, contacting us about this practice, saying that we shouldn't be doing this, that these people were already baptized and we shouldn't be rebaptizing people. Needless to say, we continued that process. But I'm guessing that that may not be as prevalent today as it used to be, but it was still around. Still, at the time of these Anabaptists, the official Protestantism seemed to differ very little from official Catholicism. We're going to move on to think about Ulrich Zwingli. And he was born 1484 and lived until 1531. Now, his life overlapped with Martin Luther, and because Luther lived 1483 to 1546, so there was an overlapping of their lives and their ministries. Now, Zwingli, like Luther, would have been called first generation reformers. They were part of that first move. Calvin is referred to as a second generation reformer. So Zwingli started out working in the Catholic Church. But he eventually came to a point where he sensed a call to pastor a church in Zurich in 1519. And he secretly married, which again would have been against the Catholic teaching at the time. And as he preached and taught within his church, his teachings began to raise eyebrows of those who had hated the newly begun Reformation, which I just refer you back to the 95 Theses of Martin Luther in 1517. So the authorities were unhappy with Zwingli. And he was happy to have public debate on this matter. But we can't take up too much of that time. So despite Zwingli being really quite radical, he inspired others who were even more radical than he. And some of his own followers said he was holding back and was not going far enough. So they split away from him and formed this group who were called the Anabaptists. And as I've mentioned, the key doctrine they stood for was believers' baptism, and they insisted that believers be rebaptized. Now, Zwingli disagreed with this, and in 1525 the Anabaptists were forbidden to stay in Zurich, and in 1527 one of their early leaders, Felix Mons, was executed by drowning. There was an interesting statement made that I will just find here. that it was as if the heretics. It was said, if the heretics want water, let them have it, and so they were put to death by drowning. During the Reformation years, between 4,000 and 5,000 Anabaptists were executed by fire, water, and sword. And this forced the Anabaptists to the north of the country. One of the members of the Anabaptist group, although not a founder of it, was someone called Simon Menno. And Simon Menno was the Mennonites are named after him. It's been commented that often we think of the Mennonites as being like the Amish or like the Bruderhof. There was a programme about the Bruderhof in the UK today on television just recently. People who dress a little bit old-fashionedly, etc. But that's not always the case. And the Amish, I believe, are part of the Mennonite movement, but oftentimes they just dress like everybody else. So there were a number of convictions that the Anabaptists had. The first was about a relationship with Christ, that Christianity needed to go must go beyond the inner experience and acceptance of doctrines. It must involve a daily walk with God in which Christ's teaching and example shape a transformed style of life. As one Anabaptist put it, no one can truly know Christ except he follow him in life. And this meant resolutely obeying the bright and clear words of the Son of God, whose word is truth and whose commandments are eternal life. Interestingly, just going back to the fact that Zwingli and Luther were contemporaries and were supportive of one another's reforms and began as allies, they fell out with one another in 1529, and the issue was to do with the Lord's presence in the communion elements. Now, the Roman Catholic Church had taught transubstantiation, that by the prayers of the priests, the bread and the wine changed into the very body and blood of Christ. And whilst he had shifted his position a little bit, he still believed that they became the body and blood, but not in that same sense. Zwingli, on the other hand, simply said that the body of Christ was literally present and really there around the elements, but they in themselves did not change. Now, there continued to be several wars around the time. Just before moving on to that, just to think of some of Zwingli's other views that he brought into church. He taught original sin only made us possess a sin nature. It did not automatically make us guilty sinners. Some of these are, of course, questionable. You may want to think about them. He said we are predestined to salvation, but only those who reject the gospel were predestined to hell. There are some groups of people who believe in a double predestination. There is a predestination of some to salvation and a predestination of others to hell. That is not the most commonly held view. Even where believers believe in a predestined to salvation, they believe that other people are going to hell not because they've been predestined to hell, but as a result of their own sin. And I've mentioned already the whole issue of infant baptism. Now, if we move on a little bit, which we need to do because of time, we come to the time of John Calvin. And John Calvin was born in 1509 and died in 1564. He's considered, as I say, a second generation reformer because he comes some time after the others. He would have only been a boy when Luther was nailing his 95 Theses up on the door at Wittenberg. He is important. John Calvin is important, and his teachings are important because his contribution to Protestantism, Reformed faith, has been enormous, and millions of Protestants around the world today see their roots in this man and in what is called a Calvinistic faith. Now, Calvin spent most of his later life in Geneva. He was actually French, but had moved to Switzerland. And around the areas where he was surrounded almost entirely by democratic lands. So it's no surprise that the system of church government he devised, which today is called Presbyterian, is much more democratic than Luther's ideas. Luther grew up in a non-democratic German province, and that affected how he did church, really. And that is an interesting thought of how much your environment in the past affects your kind of church leadership style. He was a man who loved to learn a lot more. Now, just as an interesting thing, pulling all of these things together, if Martin Luther brought the idea of salvation by faith alone, the emphasis of John Calvin is the sovereignty of God in everything, in salvation and in the ongoing Christian life, and a view that God is only really glorified when we understand his sovereignty and his control over all things. So there is an interesting difference, but it's these things that then come together to form one movement that become really very important. We don't know the date of John Calvin's conversion exactly, but his studies brought him in touch with reforming ideas circulating in Paris, and shortly thereafter an event in Calvin's life turned him in a new direction. He called it an unexpected conversion, but we don't know exactly what the date was, but it was clearly more than a kind of spiritual enlightenment or the recognition of the supreme authority of the scriptures. Calvin surrendered his will to God, and he gave up his career as a classical scholar and identified with the Protestant cause in France before moving on to Switzerland. In March 1536, he published the first edition of his highly influential Institutes of the Christian Religion, and he was only a young man at the time that this happened. He was only 26. Now, the Institutes of Christian Religion went through revisions and ended up much later on as actually 4 volumes of work, and you can usually get these in Bible packages, etc., because they're so old that they come usually free. And this is the basis of what is known as Reformed faith today, or Calvinism. And those who are of that faith look very much to this document, which doesn't change, it's static. There is a certain dislike, I guess, for Pentecostals from among Calvinists and Reformed people, because Pentecostals are just not static, really. So that is quite an important issue. Another key thing that Calvin brought out basically was to do with community influence. Geneva was one of the Swiss cantons, had gone with the Reformation under the influence of another reformer. But Calvin had a view that society should be under the control, as it were, of the church. He believed in theocracy, that the rulership of God, and he believed that extended beyond the church and into the community around. And so there was a kind of a blurring of lines between the state and the church, and it was seen that they felt that the church should have a greater oversight over what was going on in the community. So he helped put together a document that would bring a system of church government and civil government to Geneva. And it created 4 main positions or jobs in the leadership system, as it were, church and state. One was preachers, to preach and look after the affairs of the church in administration and discipline. Secondly, teachers who specialised in teaching doctrine. Thirdly, deacons, to look after practical needs of people. And fourthly, ministers and elders, overseeing the moral and doctrine issues of the church. I want to touch just really briefly now because of time elements, again, because we need to move from Switzerland to Scotland and also on to England. But the key teachings of John Calvin are summarised in what we would call an acrostic. And we use the word TULIP, T-U-L-I-P. And each one of these letters stands for one aspect of Calvinism. Now, I would say most Pentecostals are not Calvinistic. Most Pentecostals are Arminian. They stress the free will of man rather than the sovereignty of God. Although today in many churches you can go in one Sunday and they sound Calvinistic, Reformed. You can go in another Sunday and they sound Arminian. And it's maybe we just need to draw attention to something that Charles Simeon, an Anglican divine from years ago, once said on this matter of Calvinism and Arminianism, when he said that the truth is not in either of the extremes, but the truth is somewhere in the middle. And I think most of us would agree that no one would come to faith in Jesus Christ unless there was a prior drawing by the Holy Spirit. But this is not a theology course. Nevertheless, briefly, the teachings of Calvin under this acrostic of TULIP. T was for total depravity of mankind. All of humanity inherited the sin nature and guilt of Adam's sin and is left totally incapable of doing anything at all towards acquiring salvation. Now, a more Arminian position would say that humanity has the ability to put faith in God. That is one of the differences here. U, unconditional election. Those who are saved because God has chosen them to be saved. There is absolutely nothing at all that anyone could do to help get saved. It is all of God. The elect are chosen. They are not even called chosen because of God's foreknowledge. As we would teach this, they are just called chosen from eternity in the past. Sometimes a little thing I've heard one pastor say, he says people sometimes speak about, I found God. And his response to that is usually, you didn't find God because he wasn't lost. You were lost and he found you. The next letter of TULIP is L, limited atonement. Here the teaching is that Christ died for the saved only. He did not die for those who do not accept him. Now, most of us would disagree with that element, in the sense we would normally use the phrase that Jesus' death on the cross is sufficient for everyone, but only effective for those who put their faith and their trust in him. The fourth letter is I, for irresistible grace. This means that if God calls you, you must respond positively. If the Holy Spirit provokes you and reveals Christ to you, you have no choice in the matter. You must give your life to him. And then the final letter, P, perseverance of the saints, says and it's sometimes said as preservation of the saints. You cannot fall from grace. A once saved, always saved position, and that's very much the position of most of the grace teachers in the church today. Now, Calvin had immense impact, and Calvinism as a Reformed faith has had immense impact If you come from African or Asian countries, you're less likely to have been affected by this. America was not impacted by this in its early days, but now is largely Reformed Calvinistic in faith. Calvin's influence spread far and wide, and his impact on John Knox led to the Reformed faith taking over Scotland. So from early days, Scotland was a Calvinistic Reformed area, and largely I think continues to be so today. But let's, in our final minutes, turn to England. And this may surprise some of you when we look at this aspect of things. So we're going to very briefly consider the beginnings of the Anglican Church, also called the Church of England, or the Church of England is part of the worldwide Anglican Church. And this is one of those ironic stories, really, of history that might never have happened if just one or two things had happened differently. And we cannot, in this discussion, this talk today, go into a lot of the background again and the kind of history of what was going on in England, because it's far too complicated, far too time consuming with these elements. But so I'm just kind of pointing out some of the major things that came up along the way. Henry VIII is the key person in Reformation issues in England. Now, you will probably think of Henry VIII and his many wives and wonder how on earth someone like him could be involved in Protestant Reformation and a move away from Catholicism. Henry VIII was a good Catholic. When Martin Luther began the Reformation in Germany, Henry VIII became aware of some of his writings. And Henry VIII actually wrote a small book against Luther and his doctrines. And that book was called In Defense of the Seven Sacraments. So Roman Catholicism has 7 sacraments. I will not be able to remember them all. I've never been in the Catholic Church. My wife was, and I should know them, but there would have been baptism, confirmation, the Lord's Supper, marriage, last rites. There's several sacraments that the Catholic Church has held to, and Henry VIII held to the fact of those 7 sacraments, and so he wrote this book in defense of the 7 sacraments. Now, Luther and the Reformed faith only accepts 2 of those sacraments, because they believe that anything of this nature that the church does needs to be specified within scriptures. And so the scriptures only mention 2 sacraments or ordinances. Protestant churches tend to call them ordinances, things that Christ himself instructed. And they are simply water baptism, believer's baptism, and the Lord's Supper. So King Henry VIII wrote against Luther's book on this. And the Pope at the time was so happy with this book that Henry had written, that he added a new title to the long list of titles that Henry VIII already had. And he was called the Defender of the Faith. The Defender of the Faith. And every English monarch since that time, even up to the Queen, the current Queen, has held that title of the Defender of the Faith. Now, clearly, the Pope at the time was only thinking of this as being the Catholic faith, that Henry was a defender of the Catholic faith rather than of Christianity in general. But our Queen today, among the titles she has, is the Defender of the Faith. Interestingly, you may be aware that Prince Charles historically did say, and I think this might have changed as he's thought about it, but that he did say that at his coronation he would not take a title of Defender of the Faith, but would take a title of Defender of Faiths, to embrace other religions besides Christianity. Now, no one would have imagined that this same defender of the Catholic faith would lead England away from Roman Catholicism and into Anglicanism. The Reformation in England did occur because the monarch decided it would. We would obviously go beyond that and say this was something that God was doing. So Henry VIII was already picking up on undercurrents that were going on in certain directions in society, and he took them, as it were, to the end of the river. They might not have got to the same end if it had not been for what Henry did. And without going into much of the history behind all of this, Luther's writings were being circulated, and many of them were gobbled up in England by people who wanted to have their frustrations with the Roman Church verbalized. Henry had Luther's books burnt, but it did not stop the spreading of his ideas. And so, as someone has said, no book burning has ever stopped ideas from being spread. One of the things that has happened over the years is the banning of the Bible. Roman Catholicism had a list of banned books. It included Lady Chatterley's Lover, but also included the Bible, and the ordinary people were not allowed to read it. Other nations, China and many other nations, Russia has banned it, burned it, all sorts of things. It remains the best-selling book to this very day. Thomas Cranmer was Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed by Henry VIII, and he was influenced by Protestant ideas during this time as well, and he wrote the Book of Common Prayer. There are other people who are significant at this time, which we may get a chance to touch on in just a few minutes. But we need to just understand the background to this, because this Reformation came about for constitutional reasons, not spiritual reasons initially. So, fearing a civil war, Henry needed to have a male heir, but none of his wives had been able to produce a male. And Henry had been happily married to Catherine of Aragon, and they were together for over 20 years. And she had been the wife of Henry's older brother, Arthur, but Arthur died before the marriage was consummated. He'd been married off as a teenager to Catherine. And Henry was then the heir to the throne, and he was made to marry his brother's widow, so as to keep the friendly alliance between Spain and England that the first marriage had been designated for. But because she was unable to bear a male child, Henry VIII began to wonder whether actually that marriage had originally brought some kind of curse upon it. And so he made appeals to the Pope to have the marriage actually annulled. But behind all of that, of course, was the fact that Henry had fallen for a younger lady, Anne Boleyn. And although Catherine did give Henry one surviving child, a daughter named Mary, this did not fulfill what he needed. So Henry wanted a son, and as I say, he applied for a divorce or an annulment. And to divorce his wife, he needed the Roman Church to approve it. And Henry claimed that he was haunted by Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21, about marrying your brother's wife. And he used this verse to justify seeking a divorce. In 1527 was a bad time to ask the Pope for such a request. Catherine was a Spanish princess, and she was aunt of Charles V, the ruler of Spain and the Emperor of Germany. And Charles V was a big and powerful player in Europe, and the Pope was more interested in being Charles's ally rather than Henry's. Henry had Thomas Cromwell appointed as his chief minister and Thomas Cranmer appointed as Archbishop of Canterbury. In other words, he put two Protestants in as his two most important officers in order to secure his divorce. Henry made the decision with Cromwell to use the English Parliament to grant his divorce. And Parliament then made other laws as well. They did not allow clergy to live outside the country if they were paying positions in England, and they banned any appeals to the church banned any appeals from church court in England to courts outside the country. Henry also got Parliament to make him the head of the Church of England, under Christ of course, but replacing the Pope. And the famous Act of Supremacy of 1534 made him the head of the Church of England. Also in 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Succession, and that act said that all subjects of England had to take an oath of loyalty to Henry and reject papal authority. Thomas More died over that one. The repercussions of that, of course, live with us today, because right up to this day, a Roman Catholic could not become monarch in England. The Act of Succession and the Act of Supremacy allow only for someone who is of the Church of England and is not Catholic. I don't know if today that would still be resisted if people wanted to change that. As mentioned previously, going back a little bit in time, that is the very reason for issues in Ireland and Northern Ireland. Southern Ireland was a Catholic country, therefore seen to have some allegiance to Rome. Northern Ireland has allegiance to the British Crown. So that still is around today. But in his heart, Henry was still Catholic in doctrine. And the church carried on. If you went to a service, it would have appeared to be just still like a Catholic church, but it was under the leadership of Henry VIII. And so it's very much as though Henry wanted an English Catholic church as opposed to a Roman Catholic church. Now, we know that Henry continued to have more wives. Jane Seymour bore Henry a live son, but she died from the birth experience, and Henry was not therefore appreciative for the heir, Edward. And he was the next Tudor to rule after his father, although as a boy, not as a man. And Henry had three more wives. So the Anglican Church was born out of not initially religious reasons, but was born out of the kind of England's the king out of the King of England's need to get a divorce and his use of Parliament to make it legal and legitimate. Over a period of time, of course, then Henry, upset also with the Catholic Church, closed down all of the monasteries, took all of the riches, but again there was a lot of very unpleasant behaviour going on within the monasteries, etc. And so the Reformation teachings now come into England and begin to spread. After Henry VIII, there's almost a change of religion with every change of king, really. But some of the changes that were made available as part of this radical Reformation was that, again, in England, the cup of wine was made available to the masses of people and not just the bread. Priests were allowed to marry. Treason and heresy laws were changed. Church services would now be said in English and not in Latin. And the Book of Common Prayer would be used in all churches, and Cranmer was responsible for that. Something else that happened, I believe, under the reign of Henry VIII, was that the churches, all of the churches, could have a translation of the Bible. They were known as chained Bibles, and they were chained to the lecterns in the churches. What was interesting about that upset Rome, because these Bibles were translated from Hebrew and Greek into English, and the only Bibles that the Catholic Church had previously allowed into churches were ones that had been translated from Latin. Cranmer also put together what were called the 42 Articles of the Church of England. That is currently only 39. But again, there is this, just to confirm, there's quite a lot of changing backwards and forwards, but the Protestant Church has continued to be the main church in England. Now, our time on this course does not allow us to look at, but you might want to look at some time at what has been called the Catholic Counter-Reformation, because as this Reformation was going on, there were certain people in the church that came with the intention of trying to bring about another Reformation from within side. There's lots of historical elements now that we don't have the time to look at, but just to think about some of the differences, distinctives between Protestant and Catholics. It's because of these critical beliefs that are held in common that we can say that Catholics are Christians, I think. So first of all, the means of salvation. The Protestant salvation is received and maintained by faith alone. Catholics will say that it is faith and good works, notably ongoing participation in the Mass and good deeds. Confession is necessary to keep the relationship in order. Protestants say that we are saved by faith, but if it is a real faith, it will be evidenced by good works. Ephesians 2, 8-10. Protestants emphasise that salvation is one thing and doing good deeds and regular church attendance is another thing. We do good because we are saved, not try to get saved or to keep saved. Our source of authority as Protestants have the Bible as the sole authority for guiding our lives. Roman Catholicism says that the Bible and church tradition and the church's interpretation of the Bible form the basis of authority. They say that the church made the Bible and decided its contents, therefore it is a higher authority and can decide how to interpret it. Protestants say that the church only recognised the authoritative books of the Bible and gave their nod to approval to them. The nature of priesthood is different. Of course, we tend to have pastors. We don't believe that a priest has special abilities, special authority to forgive sin, to change bread and wine into the body of Christ. Catholicism has a lot of intermediaries between God and man. Protestants just believe we can we can go to God. So you've covered a lot of material there. You'll cover more in the assigned reading. Next time we're going to jump ahead again a few hundred years to come into the times of people like John Wesley, George Whitefield, and they are going to be important because they also, their teachings fed into the holiness movement, which also fed into Pentecostalism in its holy days. So I'm looking forward to those. George Whitefield is one of my heroes, but I hope so far this has helped us to see how the grasp of Catholicism was eventually broken.